Jake Martinez felt his stomach drop as the human shuttle docked with the massive alien ship. The metal walls around him groaned and shook as the docking clamps locked into place. He looked at his two companions and tried to smile, but his mouth felt dry. Lisa Park sat across from him, checking her equipment one more time, while Ben Cooper stared out the small window at the enormous vessel they were about to enter. The alien ship was called Void's Edge, and it was bigger than any human city. Its dark metal surface stretched in all directions, and strange lights pulsed along its hull like a heartbeat. Jake had seen pictures, but being this close made him feel very small. This was humanity's first real meeting with the Galactic Confederation, and Jake knew that everything depended on the next few hours. The airlock hissed open, and Jake stepped through first. The corridor beyond was huge, and built for beings much larger than humans. The ceiling rose at least 20 feet above his head, and the walls were covered in strange symbols that seemed to move when he looked at them. The air smelled like metal, and something else he could not name. 3 aliens waited for them in the corridor. Jake had studied their files, but seeing them in person was different. The largest one stepped forward, and Jake had to tilt his head back to look at its face. The creature stood nearly 9 feet tall, with a body covered in dark green armor that looked like it grew from its skin. It had 4 arms, and its head was shaped like a triangle, with large black eyes that reflected the corridor lights. "I am Commander Vextol," the alien said in perfect English. Its voice sounded like grinding stone. "You are the humans we have heard so little about." The way it said the word humans made it sound like something unpleasant. Jake stepped forward and tried to stand as tall as he could. "I am Captain Jake Martinez, representing Earth and humanity. These are my colleagues, Lisa Park and Ben Cooper. We are honored to meet you." Vextol looked down at Jake for a long moment. Then it made a sound that might have been laughter. "So small," it said to the other aliens. "Look how tiny they are. This one barely reaches my chest, and he calls himself a captain." The second alien was completely different from the first. It looked like it was made of living crystal that caught and scattered the light in rainbow patterns. When it spoke, its voice sounded like wind chimes. "I am Crystal Singer of the Zephyrite Collective. We have reviewed your species data. Very primitive, very weak. How did such fragile beings ever leave their home world?" The third alien was the strangest of all. It seemed to be made of shifting gas that held a roughly human shape inside a clear containment suit. Its voice came from speakers on the suit and sounded hollow and distant. "I am Whisperwind of the Nephilim Commonwealth. Your species appears to lack any notable capabilities. No natural weapons, no armor, no advanced sensory organs. Most puzzling." Jake felt his face getting hot, but he kept his voice calm. "Humans may not look impressive, but we have our own strengths. We have traveled to many worlds in our solar system, and we have built great cities and machines." Vextol made that grinding laugh sound again. "Your machines are toys compared to ours. Your fastest ships would take centuries to travel distances we cross in weeks. Your weapons are crude metal projectiles, while we harness the power of stars themselves." The aliens began walking down the corridor, and the humans followed. Jake noticed that each of his steps covered maybe half the distance of theirs. The corridor walls were lined with weapons and armor that looked like they belonged in a museum, but Jake knew they were probably more advanced than anything humans had ever built. "Tell me, human captain," Vextol said without turning around. "What exactly do you think your species can offer the Confederation? We have members who can survive in the vacuum of space, others who can manipulate matter at the molecular level, and some who exist as pure energy. What can weak little humans do that we cannot do better?" Lisa spoke up before Jake could answer. "Humans are very good at solving problems and adapting to new situations. We may not be the strongest or fastest, but we do not give up easily." Body flashed with different colors as it laughed. "Problem solving. We have artificial minds that can process information billions of times faster than your organic brains. Adaptation. We have species that can change their physical form at will. You offer nothing unique. They entered a massive chamber filled with alien weapons and equipment. Some of the devices were as large as human vehicles, while others were small enough to hold in one hand. Alien crew members moved through the space carrying equipment that would probably crush a human under its weight. Jake watched a Keltharian soldier pick up what looked like a cannon with one hand, while using another arm to adjust settings on its side. Perhaps a demonstration would be educational, Vextel said with what Jake was starting to recognize as cruel amusement. This is our standard infantry weapon. The alien gestured to a massive device that stood nearly as tall as Jake himself. Every Keltharian warrior carries one into battle. It fires concentrated plasma at temperatures that would vaporize your human metals. The weapon was clearly heavy, even by alien standards. Jake could see the strain in Vextel's forearms as it lifted the device. The plasma cannon was thick as a tree trunk, and covered in controls and energy conduits that pulsed with inner light. Of course your kind would need special machines to even move such a weapon, Vextel continued. Your weak muscles and fragile bones could never handle real military equipment. More aliens had gathered to watch the conversation. Jake could hear them making sounds that he guessed were laughter as they looked at the three humans. Some pointed at Ben's compact build or Lisa's small hands. Others made comments in their own languages that needed no translation. Why don't you try to lift it, human captain? Vextel said, as it set the weapon down with a heavy thud. Show us the great strength of your species. Jake looked at the massive plasma cannon and felt his heart sink. The weapon was clearly designed for beings with 4 arms and much greater strength than any human possessed. It probably weighed as much as a small human vehicle, and was balanced all wrong for someone with his body type. But as he stared at the weapon, something else stirred inside him. He had come here to represent all of humanity, and he would not let his species be dismissed so easily. Jake had spent years training for this mission, and he knew that first impressions would shape how aliens viewed humans for generations to come. I will try, Jake said quietly. The alien laughter grew louder. Jake walked slowly around the massive plasma cannon, while the aliens watched and made their clicking sounds of amusement. The weapon was even more intimidating up close, and he could see details that made his task seem impossible. The barrel alone was thicker than his torso, and the power cells along its side glowed with dangerous energy. Strange symbols covered its surface, and he could feel heat radiating from its core systems. Lisa quietly moved closer and began scanning the weapon with her handheld device. She was trying to look casual, but Jake could see the concern in her eyes. As she read the measurements, Ben stepped up beside him and whistled softly under his breath. That thing has to weigh at least 800 pounds, he murmured. Maybe more. The aliens had formed a loose circle around them now, and Jake could hear them placing bets in their various languages. Vextel stood with his forearms crossed, looking very satisfied with himself. Take your time, human captain, the alien commander said in a voice that dripped with false kindness. We understand if this is beyond your capabilities. Perhaps you would prefer to try lifting something smaller first. We have training weapons for our younglings that might be more appropriate for your species. More laughter rippled through the crowd, but Jake ignored it. He knelt down beside the weapon and began examining how it was constructed. The Keltharians had designed it for beings with 4 arms, so the weight was distributed in a way that felt completely wrong to human hands. There were 2 main grip points, but they were spaced too far apart for someone with Jake's reach. The center of gravity was all wrong too, and he could see that, even if he managed to get it off the ground, it would want to tip forward or backward. You know, Jake said, as he continued his examination, humans evolved differently than most species. He ran his hands along the weapon's surface, feeling for the best grip points. We come from a world with heavier gravity than the galactic standard. Earth pulls at us with 1.3 times the force that most inhabited worlds produce. Crystal body flickered with what Jake was learning meant skepticism. Higher gravity would make you stronger, but not strong enough to matter. The physical differences are too great to overcome. Jake smiled as he found what he was looking for. There were maintenance access points along the weapon's body that could serve as additional grip surfaces. They were not meant for lifting, but they would have to do. Humans also evolved as persistence hunters, he continued. We did not have claws like some predators or thick armor like others. What we had was the ability to keep going when other animals gave up. Interesting biology lesson, Vextel said with obvious boredom. But academic knowledge will not help you lift Caltharian military hardware. Jake stood up and looked at his two companions. Lisa gave him a small nod, and he could see that she was still recording everything with her scanner. Ben moved to get a better angle, and Jake knew his friend was ready to help if something went wrong. The trust in their eyes gave him strength and reminded him that he was not just representing himself, but all of humanity. The thing about humans, Jake said as he positioned himself beside the weapon, is that we have something most species do not understand. We call it determination, but it goes deeper than that. When a human decides that something absolutely must be done, we can push our bodies beyond their normal limits. He squatted down and wrapped his hands around the main grip points. The metal was cold, and the weapon felt even heavier than he had expected. His fingers barely reached around the thick barrel, and he had to stretch to get his second hand in position. The awkward angle put strain on his back before he even started lifting. Human mothers have lifted vehicles off their trapped children, Jake continued as he adjusted his stance. Human soldiers have carried wounded friends for miles through hostile territory. Human explorers have climbed mountains that touch the sky and dove to the deepest parts of our oceans. We do these things not because we are the strongest or fastest, but because we refuse to accept that something cannot be done. Jake began to lift, and immediately felt the enormous weight fighting against him. His muscles strained, and his back protested, but the weapon did not move. Sweat broke out on his forehead as he put more effort into the attempt. The aliens began laughing louder as it became clear that he was struggling. Perhaps that is enough, Vextal said with mock concern. We would not want you to injure yourself on your first day aboard our ship. But Jake did not give up. He reset his position and tried again with a different approach. This time he focused on getting the weapon's center of gravity over his own feet before attempting the full lift. The plasma cannon shifted slightly, and he heard the alien laughter fade into surprised murmurs. Lisa, Jake said through gritted teeth, tell them about adrenaline. Lisa stepped forward and began speaking in her clear scientist voice. Humans produce a chemical called adrenaline in stressful situations. It increases heart rate, dilates blood vessels, and temporarily enhances muscle performance. Most species have similar chemicals, but human adrenaline response is unusually strong. Jake could feel the chemical surge beginning in his system. His heart rate increased, and his muscles seemed to tighten with new energy. The weapon still felt impossibly heavy, but now it felt like something he might be able to overcome rather than an immovable object. More importantly, Lisa continued, humans can consciously trigger this response through mental focus and determination. We can literally choose to become stronger when the situation demands it. Jake adjusted his grip one more time and took several deep breaths. The alien chamber had grown quiet as they watched him prepare for another attempt. He could feel their attention like a weight on his shoulders, but he used it to fuel his determination. These aliens thought humans were weak and useless. They were about to learn otherwise. Ben, Jake said quietly, tell them about human military training. Ben's voice carried the authority of someone who had spent years preparing soldiers for impossible missions. Human military forces routinely carry equipment loads that would disable other species. A standard human infantry soldier carries 40 to 60 pounds of gear for hours at a time over difficult terrain. Special forces can carry twice that amount when necessary. Jake began his lift again, but this time everything felt different. The adrenaline was fully active now, and his muscles felt coiled like springs. The weapon's weight had not changed, but his body's response to that weight had transformed completely. Instead of fighting against an impossible load, he was now matching strength against strength. The plasma cannon rose an inch off the ground, then 2 inches. The alien crowd fell completely silent as Jake continued lifting the massive weapon with smooth, steady pressure. His face turned red with effort and veins stood out on his neck and arms, but his grip never wavered and his stance remained solid. 6 inches, 8 inches. The weapon cleared knee height and kept rising. Jake's breathing was controlled and rhythmic, even as his muscles screamed with the effort. 12 inches, 18 inches. The plasma cannon reached waist height, and Jake paused there for a moment to ensure his balance was perfect. Then, with one final surge of effort, he lifted the massive alien weapon above his head. His arms locked out straight and steady, while 800 pounds of advanced military hardware balanced perfectly in his grip. The weapon stayed there for 10 full seconds, while Jake demonstrated the control that even Keltharian power armor struggled to achieve. When he lowered the plasma cannon back to the ground, the only sound in the chamber was his own breathing. The silence stretched for what felt like forever, while Jake caught his breath, and the alien stared at the plasma cannon he had just returned to the ground. His arms still trembled slightly from the effort, but he managed to keep his expression calm as he looked up at Vextel. The alien commander's forearms had gone completely still, and his large black eyes reflected something that might have been surprise. Finally, Whisperwine spoke through his suit speakers. "Most unusual. We did not expect such capability from your species." But Vextel quickly recovered from his shock, and Jake could see anger replacing the surprise in the alien's posture. The commander's mandibles clicked together rapidly, which Jake had learned was a sign of agitation among Keltharians. A fluke, Vextel declared loudly enough for all the gathered aliens to hear. "The weapon must have been damaged, or perhaps the gravity in this section of the ship has been reduced. For maintenance." Several aliens moved forward to examine the plasma cannon, and Jake stepped back to give them room. He watched as they checked the weapon systems and tested its weight for themselves. A young Keltharian warrior tried to lift it one-handed, the way Jake had seen them do with other equipment, but even with his 4 arms and massive frame, he needed both hands and considerable effort. "The weapon is functioning normally," the young warrior reported. "Weight and balance are standard for this model." Vextel's mandibles clicked even faster. Then it was merely luck. A momentary surge of primitive muscle chemistry that cannot be repeated. The commander turned to face Jake directly. "Your species may have surprised us once, human captain, but do not mistake a single lucky moment for true capability." Crystal Singer's body pulsed with different colors as she communicated with other Zephyrite through light patterns too fast for human eyes to follow. When she finished her consultation, she turned her crystalline face toward Jake. "Our analysis suggests the human did indeed lift the weapon through natural means. However, we agree that this appears to be at the extreme limit of your species' potential. One individual performing one impressive feat does not demonstrate general capability." Jake felt his heart rate beginning to return to normal, but his muscles still hummed with residual energy from the adrenaline surge. He could have tried to argue with the aliens, but he could see that words alone would not convince them. They needed more proof that humans were worthy of respect and membership in their confederation. "If you truly believe humans are capable warriors," Vextel said with renewed confidence, "then perhaps you would care to attempt a real challenge." The commander gestured for Jake to follow him deeper into the armory, where even larger weapons waited. "Let us see how your species performs against equipment designed for actual combat rather than basic infantry work." The aliens moved through the armory in a loose group with Jake, Lisa, and Ben following behind. The humans had to walk quickly to keep up with the longer strides of their hosts, and Jake noticed that more aliens were joining their procession. Word was apparently spreading throughout the ship that something interesting was happening in the weapons bay. They stopped in front of a device that made the plasma cannon look small by comparison. The new weapon was nearly twice as tall as Jake, and much broader. Its dark metal surface was covered with cooling vents and energy conduits that pulsed with inner light. Multiple targeting sensors clustered around what Jake assumed was the business end, and the whole assembly rested on heavy support legs that had been folded for storage. "This is a Devastator-class mobile artillery piece," Vextel announced with obvious pride. "It fires antimatter projectiles capable of destroying entire city blocks. The weapon weighs 3,000 pounds and requires a full Caltharian squad to move it into position during battle." Jake walked around the massive device while trying not to show how intimidated he felt. 3,000 pounds was more than twice what he had just lifted, and this weapon was not designed with any consideration for beings with only 2 arms. The grip points were spaced for multiple Caltharian warriors working together, and the center of gravity was completely wrong for a single lifter. Lisa joined him in examining the weapon, and he could see her taking measurements with her scanner. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Jake knew her well enough to read the concern in her eyes. Ben stood back a little and crossed his arms as he studied the assembled aliens rather than the weapon itself. "Of course we do not expect your human to actually move this device," Crystal Singer said in her wind chime voice. "Even our own warriors require mechanical assistance for weapons of this size. We simply wished to demonstrate the difference between your capabilities and those required for serious military operations." More aliens had gathered now, and Jake could see representatives of species he had only read about in briefing files. There were tall, thin beings with too many joints in their arms, and short, broad creatures that looked like they were made of living rock. All of them watched the humans with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed amusement. "Your human lifted our infantry weapon," Vextel continued, "but infantry weapons are 4-foot soldiers. Real warfare requires heavy equipment that can destroy fortifications and break enemy formations. This is the kind of weapon that wins battles and conquers worlds." Jake continued his examination of the Devastator while thinking about everything Lisa had taught him regarding leverage and mechanical advantage. The weapon was enormously heavy, but it was also a machine designed by engineers who understood physics. There had to be structural elements he could use to his advantage, just as there had been with the plasma cannon. "Tell me, Vexthau," Jake said, as he knelt down to look at the weapon's base structure, "how exactly do your squads move this thing during combat? I assume you do not just grab it and carry it like a suitcase." The alien commander's mandibles stopped clicking as he considered the question. "There are lifting points designed for our grasping appendages. Multiple warriors coordinate their efforts to raise and move the device. Why do you ask?" Jake smiled as he found what he was looking for. The Devastator had been built with maintenance access points and structural reinforcements that could serve as additional grip surfaces. More importantly, it had been designed to be field-stripped for repairs, which meant certain components could be manipulated separately from the main mass. I ask because humans are very good at analyzing problems and finding solutions that others might miss, Jake replied as he stood up and dusted off his hands. "We may not have 4 arms or natural armor, but we have something else that you have not encountered before." "And what might that be?" Whisperwind asked through his speakers. Jake looked at his 2 companions and saw them nod slightly in encouragement. Lisa had finished her scans, and Ben had positioned himself where he could watch both the weapon and the crowd of aliens. They were ready to support whatever he decided to try. "Human stubbornness," Jake said simply. "When a human decides that something absolutely must be done, we have a tendency to keep trying different approaches until we find one that works. We do not accept that problems are impossible to solve just because the obvious solutions have failed." Vextel made his grinding laugh sound again, but Jake could hear uncertainty beneath the mockery. "Stubbornness will not overcome the laws of physics, human captain. Your species cannot change the fundamental reality that you are too small and weak to operate our military equipment." Jake positioned himself beside the Devastator and began his examination of the best approach for attempting the lift. The weapon was much more complex than the plasma cannon, and would require a completely different strategy. But as he studied its construction, he began to see possibilities that the aliens had probably never considered. "You know," he said as he worked out the angles and grip points, "humans have a saying about problems that seem impossible. We say that difficult things take time, but impossible things just take a little longer." Jake positioned himself at what he hoped was the optimal lifting point on the Devastator and wrapped his hands around the thick metal supports. The weapon felt like trying to embrace a small building, and his arms could barely reach around the main structural elements. He took a deep breath and began to lift with everything he had. Nothing happened. The massive artillery piece did not move even slightly, despite Jake putting his full strength into the attempt. His muscles strained, and his face turned red with effort, but the 3,000-pound weapon remained firmly planted on the armory floor. After 30 seconds of maximum effort, Jake had to give up and step back, gasping for air. The alien laughter that had been subdued after his success with the plasma cannon returned in full force. Vextel's mandibles clicked rapidly in what Jake now recognized as the Keltharian equivalent of delighted laughter. "As I suspected," the commander announced loudly. The previous lift was indeed a fluke. When faced with a real challenge, the human fails completely. Crystal Singer's body flashed through a sequence of colors that probably indicated amusement to other Zephyrite. Perhaps the human captain would prefer to return to his ship now. "We have seen enough to understand your species' limitations." More aliens had crowded into the armory to watch the spectacle, and Jake could hear them making comments in dozens of different languages. He did not need a translator to understand that they were all laughing at the small human who had thought he could lift alien war machines. Some of them were already turning away as if the show was over, but Lisa was watching Jake's vital signs on her scanner, and what she saw made her frown with concentration. His heart rate was not elevated the way it should be after maximum physical exertion. Instead, his pulse was dropping toward resting levels, which made no sense given what he had just attempted. Ben recognized the signs too. He had served with Jake in the human military and had seen his friend enter this state before, during the most challenging training exercises. Jake's breathing was becoming deeper and more controlled, while his posture shifted into something that looked almost like meditation. "Jake is entering what we call the zone," Ben said quietly to Lisa. "It is a mental state that some humans can achieve under extreme stress. Everything else gets blocked out, and the only thing that matters is completing the mission." Jake tried again, but this time his approach was completely different. Instead of attempting to lift the entire weapon at once, he began studying how it was constructed and where the stress points were located. His movements were calm and deliberate as he traced the structural supports with his hands and tested different grip positions. "Your species possesses an unusual neurological adaptation," Lisa said to the assembled aliens, while Jake continued his analysis. "Most beings are limited by safety mechanisms built into their nervous systems. These mechanisms prevent individuals from pushing their bodies to the point of serious injury." She held up her scanner so the aliens could see Jake's readings. "As you can observe, his stress hormone levels are actually decreasing despite the physical challenge he faces. This indicates that he is entering a state of focused calm rather than panic or frustration." Vextel looked at the scanner readings with obvious skepticism. Calm will not make him stronger. Physics still applies regardless of his mental state. But Jake had found something during his examination of the weapon. The Devastator was designed to be field-stripped for maintenance, which meant certain key structural elements could be manipulated independently. More importantly, he had identified leverage points that could multiply his effective lifting force if he used them correctly. "The thing about human neurology," Lisa continued, "is that we can consciously override those safety mechanisms when necessary. We call it hysterical strength, and it allows humans to temporarily exceed their normal physical limitations by 20 to 40%. Jake repositioned himself using a grip that incorporated both primary structural supports and secondary leverage points he had identified. His stance was completely different from his first attempt, and he had found a way to use the weapon's own design to his advantage. This is how human mothers lift vehicles off their trapped children, Lisa explained as Jake began his second attempt. This is how human soldiers carry wounded comrades across battlefields when conventional wisdom says it is impossible. We simply choose to ignore the limitations that our bodies try to impose. The Devastator shifted slightly as Jake applied pressure through his carefully chosen leverage points. The movement was tiny, but it proved that the massive weapon was not completely immovable. The alien laughter faded as they realized something was happening that they had not expected. Jake reset his position and tried again with adjustments based on what he had learned from the first attempt. This time the weapon moved several inches before settling back into place. His breathing remained controlled and steady even as his muscles strained against the enormous load. His vital signs are remarkable, Lisa reported as she watched her scanner. Heart rate is elevated but stable. Stress hormones are actually suppressing pain response, and muscle efficiency is operating at levels we have never recorded in laboratory conditions. Ben stepped closer to provide moral support as Jake prepared for what they all knew would be the decisive attempt. In human military training, we have a saying, Ben told the aliens. When the mission absolutely must be completed, you do not stop trying until you succeed or die. There is no middle option. Jake had found his optimal grip and stance through trial and error. The Devastator was still enormously heavy, but he had discovered ways to use mechanical advantage and leverage to multiply his effective strength. More importantly, he had achieved the mental state that allowed humans to push beyond their normal limitations. He began to lift, and this time everything came together perfectly. The weapon rose slowly but steadily as Jake channeled every ounce of human determination into the task. His face showed the strain, but his movements remained controlled and precise. 6 inches became 12 inches became 18 inches as the massive artillery piece left the ground. The alien crowd had gone completely silent as they watched something that should have been physically impossible. Jake's scanner readings showed his body operating at efficiency levels that exceeded safe parameters, but somehow avoiding the tissue damage that should have resulted when the Devastator reached chest height. Jake paused to ensure his balance was perfect. The weapon weighed 3,000 pounds, but his grip was steady and his stance remained solid. Then, with one final surge of effort that made every muscle in his body scream in protest, he lifted the massive alien war machine above his head. The Devastator stayed there for 10 full seconds, while Jake demonstrated complete control over a weapon that required entire alien squads to move. When he finally lowered it back to the ground, the only sounds in the armory were his own breathing and the quiet hum of the weapon's power systems. Vextal approached slowly with all 4 arms spread in what Jake had learned was a gesture of respect among Caltharians. The alien commander's voice was quiet and thoughtful when he finally spoke. I have misjudged your species, human captain. Jake stood beside the Devastator, trying to control his breathing while his muscles slowly returned to normal. The adrenaline was fading from his system, and he could feel the full weight of what he had just accomplished. Every part of his body ached, but he had proven something important, not just to the aliens but to himself. Humans might be small compared to other species, but they were far from helpless. Vextal extended one of his 4 hands toward Jake in the Caltharian gesture of respect. The alien commander's voice carried a tone that had not been there before. When he spoke, strength is not always about size or natural weapons. Your people possess something we have not encountered in our travels among the stars. Jake reached out and grasped the alien's massive hand with both of his own. Vextal's skin felt like warm leather covered in tiny scales, and his grip could have crushed human bones without effort. But the touch was gentle, and Jake could sense genuine respect in the gesture. What my people possess is the refusal to accept that something cannot be done, Jake replied. We may not be the biggest or strongest species in the galaxy, but we do not give up when faced with challenges that seem impossible. Other aliens began approaching with expressions that had changed completely from mockery to curiosity. Crystal Singer's body pulsed with colors that Jake had learned indicated interest and respect among her people. "We would like to understand more about human capabilities," she said in her wind chime voice. "Your species may have applications that we have not considered." Whisperwind drifted closer in his containment suit, and his speakers crackled with what might have been excitement. "Your ability to exceed normal physiological limits through mental discipline is unprecedented. We have encountered many species with various physical advantages, but none that can consciously override their own safety mechanisms." Lisa stepped forward with her scanner still recording data from Jake's performance. "What Captain Martinez demonstrated is not unique to him. All humans possess this capability to some degree. We call it hysterical strength, and it has allowed our species to survive and thrive in situations that would defeat others." A young Keltharian warrior who had been watching from the crowd spoke up with obvious admiration in his voice. "How did you know where to grip the weapon? Our training teaches specific lifting techniques, but you used methods we have never seen." Jake smiled as he looked at the massive artillery piece that had nearly defeated him. "Humans are very good at analyzing problems and finding unconventional solutions. When the obvious approach does not work, we try different methods until we find one that does. We call it thinking outside the box." Ben joined the conversation with the authority of someone who had spent years training soldiers. "Human military doctrine emphasizes adaptability and improvisation. We train our people to use whatever resources are available, rather than relying only on standard equipment and procedures." More aliens gathered around as word spread throughout the ship that something remarkable had happened in the armory. Jake found himself answering questions about human physiology, psychology, and culture from beings he had only dreamed of meeting. The tone of their inquiries had shifted completely from dismissive mockery to genuine scientific interest. A massive creature that looked like it was carved from living stone asked about human endurance capabilities. Jake explained how humans could run for hours without stopping, and how they had evolved as persistence hunters, who outlasted rather than overpowered their prey. A graceful being with too many joints in her arms wanted to know about human problem-solving methods. Lisa described how human scientists and engineers approached challenges by testing multiple theories simultaneously rather than following single predetermined paths. Several smaller aliens clustered around Ben as he explained human military tactics that emphasized flexibility and adaptation over brute force. They seemed fascinated by the concept of using terrain and circumstances to gain advantages over technically superior opponents. "Your species appears to specialize in situations that others would consider hopeless," Vextel observed as he listened to the various conversations. "This could be valuable to the Confederation in ways we have not previously considered." Crystal Singer's body flashed through a complex pattern of colors as she communicated with other Zephyrite throughout the ship. When she finished the rapid light-based conversation, she turned back toward the humans. "We are receiving reports from our science teams. Your physiological data indicates capabilities that extend far beyond simple physical strength." Jake looked at his two companions and saw the same mixture of exhaustion and excitement that he felt. They had come to this meeting hoping to prove that humanity deserved a place in the galactic community. What they had discovered was that humans might have something unique to offer that no other species possessed. "We would like to propose something different than standard Confederation membership," Vextel announced, after consulting with the other senior aliens present. "Your species would not join as junior members, requiring supervision and guidance. Instead, we suggest that humans serve as specialists in scenarios that conventional wisdom declares impossible." Lisa raised her eyebrows in surprise. "What exactly would that involve?" Whisperwind answered through his speakers with obvious enthusiasm. "There are situations throughout the galaxy where standard approaches have failed repeatedly. rescue missions in hostile environments, diplomatic negotiations with unreasonable parties, military operations against overwhelming odds. These are challenges that require beings who refuse to accept defeat. A new alien that Jake had not seen before entered the armory and approached their group. This being was taller even than the Caltharians, and moved with fluid grace despite its massive size. When it spoke, its voice carried the authority of high rank. "I am Admiral Korath of the Confederation Deep Fleet," the newcomer announced. "Word of today's demonstration has reached the highest levels of our command structure. We have missions that have been classified as impossible for standard forces. Perhaps it is time to try the human approach." Jake felt his heart racing again, but this time it was excitement rather than adrenaline. The prospect of humanity taking on challenges that other species could not handle was exactly the kind of opportunity he had hoped for, but never dared to expect. "What kind of missions?" Ben asked with professional interest. Admiral Korath gestured toward the viewport where stars stretched to infinity beyond the ship's hull. "There are worlds where our people are trapped by circumstances beyond conventional rescue capabilities. There are conflicts that have resisted all attempts at resolution through standard diplomatic channels. There are exploration targets that have defeated every expedition we have sent." Jake looked at the massive devastator that he had somehow managed to lift, and then at the faces of the aliens, who were no longer laughing at humanity's limitations. Instead, they were looking at humans as potential solutions to problems they had been unable to solve. "When do we start?" Jake asked. The sound that came from Vextal's throat was definitely laughter, but this time it carried warmth and anticipation, instead of mockery. "Welcome to the Galactic Confederation, humans. We have been waiting for a species like yours without even knowing it." As Jake prepared to return to his ship with news that would change humanity's future forever, he realized that lifting alien weapons had been the easy part. The real challenge would be living up to the galaxy's expectations and proving that humans truly specialized in making the impossible merely difficult. The stars had never looked more inviting.